Let's go through trimming half rectangle triangles. These are a little bit of a trickier unit to trim, especially when compared to half square triangles, because we don't have that nice 45-degree angle for the diagonal seam. And so that just makes things a little tricky. We can't simply trim this where that seam runs directly into the corner, because then our seam would not run directly into the corner of the finished unit. And so let's walk through how to get those nice points and um, proper seam alignment with our HRTs. So I want to trim this HRT to a unfinished size of 4.5 by 8.5. And so the first step is to mark off what those trim dimensions are on your ruler. I like to use washi tape. You could use any other removable tape or some other marking tool. But the idea is to kind of get that, mark off that area on your ruler. Now, as a right-handed quilter, I'm going to mark this off from the top right corner because that allows me to trim to the right and to the top. If you are left-handed, you might want to mark out this rectangle from the top left. Otherwise, you can follow along and just do it from the top right and then simply rotate everything so that you're not doing any cuts that that might be dangerous to you. But again, as a right-handed quilter, I'm going to kind of start at this 0, 0 point that's on my ruler. And all rulers are different, I found. So you might not have this 0, 0, but as long as you can measure out the proper dimensions from that corner, it should be fine. So I mentioned for this particular HRT, I want it to trim down to 4.5 by 8.5. So I'm going to take some tape and mark out those dimensions. So I'm right now marking the 4.5 width, and I'm making sure that I come down at least to what my length is. So here's that 8.5 inch line. So I want to make sure I at least go to that. And if you can see, I like to place my tape just a hair outside of the dimension that I'm marking. It gives me a little extra visibility. And now I'm going to do the same thing to mark off the 8.5 inch length down here. Okay, so essentially this represents the area of what I want my HRT to be trimmed to, or those unfinished dimensions. Now, I mentioned before that we can't simply trim our HRT so that the diagonal seam runs into the corners, that it won't finish properly then once we go to sew it into our block. And so we really have to take into account the 1/4 inch seam allowance around all 4 sides of that HRT. And how we do that, in this case, I have that right leaning HRT. So that seam is running into the bottom left corner and the top right corner. And so I'm going to start there. And so I'll start in this top right. And essentially I want to find the point that is a square 1/4 inch inside that top right corner, or that 0, 0 point. So from this top right, I'll go to the left a 1/4 inch and down a 1/4 inch. And I like to circle that point. Just again, it gives me visibility to make sure that that point is exactly where I want it, as opposed to maybe just kind of emboldening it and making it bigger. And then I'm going to do the same thing in this bottom left corner. So again, for me, this is my 4.5 by 8.5 inch rectangle. And so from that kind of 4.5 by 8.5 coordinate, I'm going to measure in a square 1/4 inch. And so I'll go to the right a 1/4 inch and up a 1/4 inch. And again, I'll circle that point. Now, if you were trimming, say, a left leaning HRT, or maybe you have both, depending on the pattern, you may just have, HRTs leaning one direction or the other. If you've got some leaning right, some leaning left, I like to go ahead, as long as they're getting trimmed to the same dimensions, you can go ahead and mark those same points in those other two sets of corners that are a square 1/4 inch inside. So from this top left corner, I'll go to the right a 1/4 inch and down a 1/4 inch and circle that point. And then again, from this bottom right, I'll go up a 1/4 inch and over to the left a 1/4 inch and circle that point. And so again, this is only if you've got both right-leaning and left-leaning HRTs that you are trimming to the same dimensions. Once any dimension changes, some points are going to have to shift. So, because you're always wanting those points that are a square 1/4 inch inside those corners. So just something to keep in mind. Now, once your ruler is all marked up, I'll place it on top of the HRT. And there's a couple things that a kind of mental checklist that you want to make sure of. One is that, similar with when you're trimming half square triangles, you want to make sure you've got full coverage for the dimensions that you're trimming down to, right? So this is why I like that additional visibility beyond the dimensions that I'm marking, so I can make sure that my unit underneath the ruler extends at least beyond, even if just very slightly, in this case, the 4.5 and 8.5 inch lines. Because otherwise, if we're a little short, then I won't quite get the HRT that I need. So that's the first item. And the second is that we want that diagonal seam to go right through those 2 points that we circled. And so you're just kind of keeping those things in mind and keeping them balanced. Obviously you could end up with your ruler down here, but you're missing some width over here, or you could have full coverage, but your points aren't lined up. So you really want to try to check both those boxes. And then once you feel good about those points being right on top of that diagonal seam, and then again, checking that you've got coverage beyond and then a little bit exposed, right? You've got some margin to trim off. You can trim those 2 exposed edges. Okay. Now you can see this is blunted. So that's part of trimming half rectangle triangles. Like I said, that seam it's not supposed to run into the corner of our trim HRT, but this helps to ensure that once we account for those 1/4 inch seam allowances on all sides, that seam will run through the corner of the finished HRT. So I've trimmed these 2 edges. Now I'm going to rotate this 180 degrees, and I'm going to line up these 2 trimmed edges with the dimensions marked off on my ruler. And depending on how precise or good our first set of trims were, if you line up your trimmed edges with the dimensions marked off on your ruler, you will hopefully find that those 2 points fall directly back onto that diagonal seam. But you may need to do just a little bit of nudging, which is fine. And then once you feel good, your edges are lined up, the points are on that diagonal seam, you can trim those 2 remaining edges. And there is your trimmed half rectangle triangle. And again, if you were needing to trim a left-leaning HRT, it would be the exact same thing, except now I went ahead and marked those other 2 points that are each a square 1/4 inch inside those corners. And so now those are the 2 points that I'm paying attention to when I go to trim this one. So that is your HRT trimming tutorial and go forth and conquer half rectangle triangles.